All names below have been changed. My wife's Aunt Louise is a great lady. She and her husband lived in the SF Bay Area and bought their home in the late 1970s. After her husband passed, she sold her home for well over $1 million and moved back to live closer to her family where she grew up, farming areas in southern CA. She lives very frugally, so doesn't really have to worry about money. Aunt Louise had 3 children, who are now all in their 40s and early 50s. The 2 oldest are nice, normal people. Her youngest, Kay, is a real piece of work. She meets all the criteria for a psychological diagnosis of narcissism. Aunt Louise just turned 70. She's really happy about it. She had some health scares last year and decided to celebrate. She's a very kind and giving person, and celebrating to her means doing something nice for others. Aunt Louise has 3 children, 14 nieces and nephews, and 40-plus grandnieces and grandnephews. I don't know how much she sent to everyone, but based on what she sent to my wife, her niece, and knowing how much she likes to be fair, the nieces and nephews each received a check for $1,000. Based on what she sent to our kids, I suspect each grandniece and grandnephew received a check for $500. There was also a very kind and personalized note to each person, saying how much she loved them and imploring them to do something fun with this money. Don't pay bills with it. It was generous and sweet, and when a couple of the kids came by this weekend for a barbecue, we talked about Aunt Louise, their plans for the money, and as I suspect was Aunt Louise's intent, we had happy conversations about fun plans. Then the email came. For background, Aunt Louise's daughter Kay audits her mother's finances that would make the IRS blush. Last Christmas, she berated her mother for vacationing to NYC with a friend. Louise has always wanted to visit NYC at Christmas. She has frequently talked about plans for her inheritance, with her still very much alive mother sitting right next to her. Kay sent my wife and others an email claiming that her mother is suffering from dementia and Alzheimer's with a request. More on that below. While we suspected this was Kay being Kay, my wife still called Aunt Louise, just in case. All of this was news to Aunt Louise, who was lucid as always. Here's the best part. In the email, Kay asked everybody to send the money they received from Aunt Louise to her, Kay, rather than Aunt Louise. Kay nobly volunteered to handle all the deposits herself to avoid being a burden on poor Aunt Louise, clearly too infirm to attend to such taxing matters. In light of the times that Kay has helped herself to Aunt Louise's money without permission, stealing is such an ugly word. I'm fairly convinced not a dime would make it way back into Aunt Louise. Like and subscribe. Top 3 comments and OP responses. 1. I hope Aunt Louise has a legally sound will and executor lined up to make sure Kay can't fight when Louise dies, eventually passed on, and remove any access Kay currently has to her money and financial records. Kay is a piece of work. OP. She's hired a law firm for this, knowing that if she appointed one of her sons, it would fracture the family. Sadly, it's long past that point. Aunt Louise is the only thing holding them together. The sons have mentioned to me repeatedly that after she passes, they don't care what happens to Kay. As for access, Kay can't access Aunt Louise's money anymore after helping herself to $15,000 back in the early 2000s. Kay still attempts to go through her mail when she visits. 2. Y'all are suspiciously sanguine about this whole naked financial abuse thing. OP. Sadly, this is just one chapter in a long book. Aunt Louise has taken steps with a lawyer and accountant to protect herself. That is the fullest extent she'll go. She is aware of who Kay is and what she does, but then she says things like, "She's my daughter, what can I do?" And through that inaction, hopes for change end. She is aware of Kay's latest scheme. If she confronted Kay at all, I have no doubt Kay told her, "I was gonna deposit the money for you." And no doubt that Aunt Louise didn't believe a word. Response to OP. My grandmother was a sharp woman. She had 8 children, my mom the oldest. She and my grandfather were school teachers and expected their children and grandchildren to be educated also. Everyone except one of Mom's brothers were college graduates and beyond. That brother was a goof-off, never really worked, etc. Married a woman with 7 children and expected my grandmother to help support them, as their dad was in prison. Back before credit cards, small towns had businesses that would sell things on their account. Uncle's wife bought new washer/dryer and TV and had it billed to my grandmother. Before it was delivered, they called Grandma. Luckily, She refused to pay for the items. Uncle and his wife then spent weeks trying to convince everyone that my grandmother had dementia. They also were living in a house she owned, but stopped paying rent when my grandfather died. After a few years of arguing over it, Grandma just sold the house. When she died, her estate included a list of all the money he owed her. It was included in her estate and deducted from his share. He was not happy and tried to fight it, but she had a clause in it that if he fought over it, he'd get nothing. 3. I used to do all the paperwork for neurologists in a clinic setting. A random relative trying to get power of attorney over an elderly family member's finances was, sadly, a common occurrence. One incident involved a man whose children didn't like him gambling. My doctor examined him with his children present and said he was clearly lucid. He could spend his money however he wanted. Your aunt should visit a lawyer and name one of her other kids executor of her estate. OP. Aunt Louise has hired an accountant and lawyer to avoid this. Per one of her sons, she hired the accountant to be the bad cop. When Kay asks for money, Aunt Louise blames the accountant. "I'm sorry, honey. My accountant says it's not in my allowance."